At the last minute. There's so many makers here of all different kinds. It is not just, robots and rocketry like you might expect. As we've shown you, it's things like making collages or, my God, watch and clocks. I mean, talk about ancient technologies, right?
I guess there are a couple of things to buy. I didn't have any idea.
No, these aren't for sale. Oh,
This guy's got analog clocks.
this is so cool to see the inner workings of some of these very old clocks from the 1800s even. This is the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. They've got a bluegrass chapter. Did you know that about the National Association?
I didn't even know there was a national association, but I am glad to know that someone's interested in preserving these fine mechanical systems. I mean, these are so interesting to me when I was young.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, I used to destroy these things all the time, taking them apart, trying to figure them out. Occasionally, I'd get one back together okay, but they were never quite right. I'm a menace to these things, but I do find them very interesting.
Well, once you lose one of these parts on the floor,
don't even start. Yeah, it's ridiculous. Who knows how many very expensive pieces of equipment were doomed over that one part Brian lost.
Look at this one in the front. It's made out of paper mache, the cabinet for the clock.
That is so cool.
As part of the war effort. Some of these date back to the 20s, 1800s. What a cool little display of watches and clocks from history. And you can come and see them working. This is precision stuff. They say they don't make things like they used to. That's certainly true with watches and clocks, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of people would say that there's, those are positive innovations. But when you look at this kind of stuff, the artistry and
the craftsmanship.
Yeah, well, and also just the precision to be able to, to keep the time with these machines and know how to keep up with maintaining them. I just think it's important that we keep this stuff going.
There's a couple pendulums swinging at this booth. You want to tell us about this clock?
Yeah, this is a wooden movement clock.
Oh my
from
gosh!
About 1820, made up in Connecticut.
1820.
Oh yeah, it's 200 years old.
Wow!
Still functioning, a little bit dirty, but this is the same movement taken apart. These are all the different pieces that go into a clock movement. But they made these. Eli Terry started the wooden movement by mass production. He was actually the first person that did mass production in the world.
Wow.
He had a contract in 1807 to produce 4,000 of these in 3 years. What they called the Porter contract, and he completed the contract. Then he sold the company to Seth Thomas and Silas Hoadley. These are Hoadley movements. Eli Terry saw the writing on the wall and went and started making pillar and scroll clocks, which were shelf clocks.
Okay.
And Eli Terry or Seth Thomas and Silas Hoadley continued to make the tall case clocks for another 10 or 15 years, and then they split up. Seth Thomas, you probably heard of the Seth Thomas Clock Company.
Sure.
That's still it's in existence in some semblance, but they were actually an American company up until the 1950s. Silas Hoadley retired in about 1840 as a very rich man, but he made shelf clocks too, but mostly wooden movements because they could make these much more inexpensive than a brass movement. Brass at that time was one, expensive, and two, very difficult to get because there were no brass foundries in this country.
Yeah.
By 1840, they had brass foundries, so they started making this type of movement, which basically put the wood movements out of business because they could make these as cheap as these. Plus, you didn't have the maintenance problems with these. They would, the Americans actually took over the world clock market. But they couldn't send these over because you send these on ships for 3 months and they'd warp so badly because of the salt air. It wouldn't work. But once they started making the brass movements, so you'll see a lot of American clocks, many times with English cases, coming back to the U.S., that have been imported over back 1850, 1860, 1870.
Very
interesting. They took over the market. We were kind of like the Chinese. We were the low-cost producer.
Yeah.
Back in those days, back in the mid-1800s. Same way with the watch business.
And were these powered by springs, even the wooden? How do they?
Oh wait. Yeah, spring technology was so bad that the French were making springs. There's a few spring clocks from those days, but they were very expensive. So they were literally doing weights. That's why they call them grandfather clocks. Their proper name is tall case clock. They had a longer weight drop, so they could run a week with the weights. These were weight driven.
Wow.
This is weight driven. See, this is from about 1840. When they developed it, then they could put a spring in the same spot, and you could make a clock. This type of clock would be about 26 inches tall that would run 30 hours or run one day.
Okay.
But it was 26 inches to it, a little over 2 feet tall. They could put this type of movement, or once they put springs in these, they could put a clock that big and it would run for a week.
Wow.
And so the size of the clock is dependent on the weights that are in
When
it.
they were using
How long
weights,
you want to run it?
It was dependent on the weight. Yeah.
Interesting,
So
okay.
about the shortest you'd see would be about the 2 feet tall.
Okay.
And those would only usually run one day. They actually made these in an 8-day movement. These would run one day, the wooden ones. But they did make some 8 days with heavier weights that were compounded. But you don't see many of them around because the extra weight tore them up.
Sure,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
So what blows my mind about this clock from 1820, thinking back to then, 1820, this is before railroad time even existed, right?
Yeah.
So everyone's perception of what noon was totally different, but you wanted to keep time in your own locale and make sure it's your noon is the same noon every day, right?
Well, that's why a lot of the cities had like a tower clock
Yes,
where people
the
could set
clock
their
tower.
clocks. In fact, there's a joke going around that there was a jeweler in this one town that always set his clocks by the clock tower because the clock tower would strike, he'd set his clocks. Well, at one point after years of doing this, he talked to the guy that was running the clock tower, and the clock tower said, "Well, I'm setting my clock by yours." So neither one of them had any idea what time it was.
And yet we would go to such lengths to create a device to keep time, even though it was all relative. That's what blows my mind.
Now, this is like a railroad grade watch.
Yes.
But they actually, I think it was in the 1890s or so. Don't quote me on that. But they had a few accidents where people's watches were off and there were collisions
Trains
among
would collide.
trains.
Wow.
Yeah. Well,
Wow.
a guy named Ball up in Cleveland developed the Ball standard, and he was a real entrepreneur. He had a business selling watches, but he created a system where the people, like the engineers and the conductors stuff that were running the trains, had to have their watches certified. And I think it was every 3 months or so they had to send them in and make sure that they were running correctly so they would keep time. And they had certain grades of watches, like this is a 19 Joule. They went up to 21, 23, had to be adjusted positions and all, and temperature had to be lever set. You can't, on this type of watch, you can't pull the stem out and set it. You had to. There's a lever here that you have to unscrew the face to get to set, so you couldn't inadvertently undo it or change the time.
Right. Because a lot of those are really easy.
But he developed a great system where you had to have them certified, so everybody was on the same time.
Interesting.
But back in the old days, before they actually did that, I've got a friend down in Chattanooga that collects railroad clocks and watches, and he's got a clock that this is railroad time and this is true time or Greenwich time.
Oh,
and there's a
wow.
little, different cities.
Really?
It might be in Cleveland it might be 8 o'clock, but in this town it might be 8:03.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because of the setting of the sun.
Right.
And they got rid of that with the time zones.
Yes, the
And again,
time zone.
for the same reason with the railroads and stuff.
Fascinating. So great to talk to you. Come on out and check out the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors booth here at the Louisville Makerfaire. If you hurt yourself on the clock, there's a first aid station right next door to help you out. Safety first at the Makerfaire. I mean, there is flame outside. I mean, there's glass blowing and there's rockets.
Yeah, there are rockets. That's right. And remember, if you come down to the Makerfaire, free parking, or you could ride your bike for free. Good stuff.
Yeah. So like we said, it's not just rockets and robots. There's things like the International Honor Quilt here at the Louisville Makerfaire. You want to tell us